The Dust Bowl was one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. People know about the Dust Bowl, but they don't think of it as a Colorado story.
They plowed up much of the southern prairie and loosened the topsoil, so those strong winds just carried away millions of tons of topsoil.
America's economy collapsed in the 1930s. 1 in 4 Americans were unemployed.
Drought and depression ravaged the southern plains.
You had a perfect storm of economic crisis and climate crisis.
They always called it the dirty 30s. Those were the really hard times out on the dry, and the wind blew and blew, and there was nothing to stop it.
These immense storms, they have like this physicality to them.
The crops withered and died. There was no water for the livestock.
It was really a tumultuous time.
It felt like the end of the world. There was no way out of this.
Colorado Experience is made in partnership with History Colorado,
inspiring generations to find wonder and meaning in our past and to engage in creating a better Colorado. HistoryColorado.org.
with funding provided by the University of Denver, celebrating 150 years, the Denver Public Library, the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
American explorers who first came into Colorado were not fooled by the conditions. They accurately identified the plains of Colorado as a desert.
It was rangeland. It was very dry and is described as the Great American Desert, not inhabitable on some maps.
Zebulon Pike and then Stephen Long both looked around and said, this land is unsuitable for agriculture.
With the gold rush of 1858, many people were flooding into the state and going to the mountains in search of gold and other precious metals. In this area, what that meant is that all those miners up there needed a food source. And so people moved into this area to settle, to do cattle ranching. And so sometimes these early settlers, when they moved into the area, they would homestead around a key area, like around a spring or access to water. And then they'd use open range across the rest of the area.
After the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, boosters and developers said this is a potential Garden of Eden. If we can only bring water to the plains, we can make this land bloom. If we can only find the scientific forms of agriculture, we can conserve water and we can farm without benefit of irrigation.
After the Civil War, you had the cattle drives across Baca County with their big cattle herds and longhorn steers going to greener grass north.
The Homestead Act of 1862, you get essentially 160 acres for a filing fee and improvement of your property.
It was a law that opened up free government land for homesteading. And if they lived there for 5 years and made improvements on it, they owned it outright. In order, as they said, to prove up your land, farmers had to put up fences, they had to break the soil, plant seeds, build a house. There were specific regulations about building a house. A house had to be 20 by 40, but it didn't say 20 by 40 inches or feet. Some people would cheat by building a little model house that they would put on the land, swear to a notary public that they had a house 20 by 40 on their property, and then rent it to the neighbor down the road so that they could make the same oath on their land. There are all kinds of ways to get around the regulations of the Homestead Act. This was the largest land giveaway in American history. Beginning in the 1870s and 1880s, farmers moved onto the plains of Colorado and Kansas and the Dakotas, Texas and New Mexico and Oklahoma.
And they called them nesters. The nesters would set up camp beside the water. They would develop that and start farming.
People who loved the plains came there essentially with this dream of homesteading, of finding this place to essentially support their families on the land. Baca County is the farthest southeastern corner of Colorado. It's one of the remotest parts of Colorado. And if you look at a map of Baca County then, you can tell that they're dreaming these really big dreams. There's a Minneapolis there, there's a Boston there, there's a town called Progress. We think of the plains as very flat, but it's a complex landscape. There's some little canyons, there's a lot of rolling hills. It's arid, so there's not a lot of creeks or rivers. There's no railroad going through there yet. There's not a railroad going through Baca County until the 1920s. So logistically, how do you get there in the first place? And then how do you get your crops to market? So people come out there with these big dreams, but they realize that the land actually may be too much for them.
They tried to grow agriculture without irrigation by depending only on rainfall, and for a while they were successful. They used dryland farming techniques, which encouraged them to plow deep in order to bring the spring rains deep within their soil, to harrow after every rainfall, to pulverize the soil to keep the topsoil moist. And as a result of these techniques, farmers, for a while, were able to do very well on the plains.
Whenever you break virgin soil, it produces well. So they had a good start.
The Great Plains of eastern Colorado really went through two boom and bust cycles. The first one was in the early 1880s. And as farmers came in under the Homestead Act, they began producing it in what was one of those very wet cycles. They produced so much grain that there was really no place to store it.
You have to remember that this was brand new virgin country, and of course you didn't have storage facilities then. They piled it on the ground, they hauled it off in their old trucks. Then they actually flooded the market because it overrode the infrastructure to haul it away.
Because of overproduction and then severe drought in the early 1890s, the early boom collapsed by about 1893. In 1909, this new enlarged Homestead Act sparked a new land boom, which allowed farmers to take a double parcel of land for virtually nothing. That act coincided with another wet cycle. It coincided with the First World War and a need to supply grain for Europe. It was so easy to take up land in the early 1900s that it was virtually irresistible. Beginning in about 1910, the plains went through a cycle of above average rainfall.
Typically this area would get somewhere between 10 and 12 inches a year. During those times it was higher end of that, 12 to 14. And so what that meant is that when these people homesteaded in an area, they were having good crops.
Farmers came onto the land right at the time when World War I began, driving up the demand for American wheat. As we became the breadbasket for war-torn Europe, Americans realized that their golden opportunity lay on the plains. During World War I alone, agriculture prices tripled. And as a result of that, more and more farmers broke land on the plains until ultimately 13 million acres of land on the dry land were under cultivation. It seemed like everything was working out. The farmers were coming to the land, the rain was falling, the prices were high. There was really no way that you could lose in this scenario.
And sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you on a new project is have instant success. And it maybe gives us a little false sense of security.
They went into debt to buy more land. They went into debt to buy more machinery, more tractors, to plow up still more acres. This hunger for cultivatable land ultimately led to a collapse.
My father, Monty Robert Gordy, came to Baca County in 1913. He come from Oklahoma, and he was homesteaded on a half section of ground in the northeast corner of Baca County.
My grandfather loaded up the old covered wagon, so to speak, and headed west. And he developed a claim northwest of Springfield, about 14 miles. And they started that homestead out there in 1917. He bought what they called a relinquishment, and that had been homesteaded at another time by somebody else, but they didn't satisfy the requirements of the homestead. And so he set up camp, dug a hole in the side of the ground, made a little soddy, and started farming. What does a soddy look like? Basically dig a hole in the ground and pile some sod bricks up around it, and then use whatever roofing material that they could come up with. Those were nasty places to live because the creatures crawl in and out, you know, and when it rained mud. It was a hard life, you know, no doubt. Even when it was a good time, it was a hard life.
There was tough times and it was hard, but all of my memories of my childhood and my life on the dry are very positive ones. We always had love, we had plenty to eat, we had a place to stay, we had clothes to wear, we had one another, family picnics, and Mom would take us fishing, and at night we would go hunting, and we had great times.
The image that people have of homesteading, it is what I call the Little House in the Prairie model, where you have like the blonde girl, the blonde mother, the father with the ox wagon, and going to the west and settling in those areas. But it is a much more complex, much more diverse population. Some of the earlier movements towards the West, particularly black movements, had to do with the end of Reconstruction. So after 1877, more or less, you start having populations moving from the South. People wanted to live places where Jim Crow was and Ku Klux Klan and so on. So they moved to areas to create their own communities where they could be more successful.
My mother's family came to Colorado in 1916. May 1st, they loaded up their wagon and hitched up their team and headed from Oklahoma. And by the end of May, they had reached Colorado. And they had stopped along a waterway and here in the Manzanola area, and they saw this gentleman, and he had a wagon with some barrels on it, and he was filling them with water. And so her father asked him, how do you get to the land that they're homesteading? The man said, go back. He said, you don't want to be here. This is not the place to be. Her father said, well, I have nothing to go back to. They headed out to the dry. For 100 miles, you could see nothing but dry. She said, you know, in Oklahoma, we were used to the red soil and the green grass and the trees and streams running. And she said, there was nothing. She said, there was not a tree. She said, I didn't hear a bird. She said, I just broke down in tears. But her father was going to homestead, and that's what he'd come for.
The dry is located south of Manzanola, about 10, 11 miles in the southeastern part of Colorado. It's very open sky, very harsh landscape, very flat, and you can see for miles and miles.
Everyone locally knows that the dry land is the area where there is no irrigation. They call it the dry land, and then the people that live there, they said, well, where do you live? Out on the dry. At the peak, there probably was 45 to 50 families that settled on the dry. And they would have periods where they would have enough snow and enough rain where they could plant some crops, but it was never what anyone thought it would be.
They had something in mind that was something that had been promised to them, that was irrigation agriculture, and it wasn't happening. And that's why they started leaving. It was quite early, before the Dust Bowl.
Farmers would hire them to work, and my mother always laughed. She said, you know, it was out of the cotton fields and into the beet fields. My mother and father stayed, and her father and Lula Craig, my grandmother, and her family stayed, but the majority of the people left the dry land.
Owning land, even if it was dry and inhospitable, was important for African Americans.
It's a chance of a lifetime for us to own some property and have a place that we can call our own.
Drought happens about every 20 years on the plains.
The 22-year period spanning the First World War in the 1920s and into the 1930s was a natural phenomenon. What complicated matters was the human use of the land, the overplowing, the overproduction that took place, set the table for the worst environmental catastrophe in American history.
Because it's so arid out there, you actually need a fair amount of land in order to make it. And if you have machinery, you can till more land, you can plant seed, you can harvest a lot easier.
Modern technology really, instead of enhancing the situation, it demeaned the environment. And it wasn't really anybody's quote unquote fault. We might have had some unrealized expectations. But given the data that they had to make decisions with, we might have all made the same decisions.
An interesting thing happens at the end of the First World War. Because so many European nations are in debt, the demand for exported wheat collapses. Wheat prices plummet, and as a result of that, farmers have to go into an interesting cycle of debt and overproduction in order just to keep their heads above water.
Well, you planted about half a bushel. You'd have to get a little more out of it than you put in it, or you'd go broke. And some guys back in those days went broke too.
But in the 1920s, a couple of things happened. The price of wheat began to fall, but at the same time, it began to get drier. The yields that had been so fabulous during the First World War began ever so slightly and then increasingly to diminish over time. A lot of farmers had gone into debt to buy land during the war or to buy new farm machinery, but when the price of wheat began to drop, they had to plant more and more land in order to make ends meet. So through the 1920s, American farmers were in serious trouble. Their only way out of their dilemma of debt and falling wheat prices was to plow even more land. And that just further set the stage for disaster. By the end of the 1920s, most American farmers were on the ropes, and then it stopped raining.
Well, it was dry and hot, and once in a while we'd get a few drops of rain.
Large chunks of earth would just crack and break. You could go out and lift it up. The kids would stack it together and make houses. It was just that dry.
Fields that were once green that people thought was their American dream dried up, and the very, very fine dust that you find down there started to blow.
Living on the Eastern Plains during the Dust Bowl was perhaps the most trying experience in American agricultural history. The first dust storms began in 1931, and they really continued all through the 1930s.
They always called it the dirty 30s. Those were the really hard times out on the dry, and the wind blew and blew, and there was nothing to stop it. I mean, there was so much dust that came into the little old houses that they'd built that they stuffed newspaper in the cracks. And Mother said she would hang these sheets and burlap bags or whatever you had up to the windows. They would wet them, and they would catch the dust and keep it out of the house and keep them from choking.
It was terrible. You couldn't hardly breathe. Some people got dust pneumonia.
If you were young or elderly, you were especially susceptible to this, and some people die of it.
My father was still having to haul water, and they had the team of horses. There was so much dust and so much dirt that it packed into the horse's nose, and he had to keep getting down with a wet cloth and cleaning the horse's nose. And by the time he got back, one of the mares, her name was Bravo, her nose started to bleed. And it bled and bled, and my mother said she had to tear up strips of cloth and wet them and pack the horse's nose, and Dad had to hold it tight. And so she made some cloth muzzles, and he would tie those over the horse's nose, and he would keep that wet, and it kept the dust out of his horse's nose.
Baca County was one of the parts of the Southern Plains hit hardest by the Dust Bowl. People called it and some of the neighboring counties essentially the epicenter of the Dust Bowl. During the Depression, more than half of the population is on relief of some sort. So it's a part of Colorado that is essentially where you see the problems of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression and this kind of environmental tragedy play out most dramatically. Black Sunday, which is April 14th, 1935, largely considered to be the worst dust storm of the Dust Bowl. It was a beautiful morning, and you can tell it's coming because the animals react to it. Birds just start flying, trying to get ahead of it. Livestock start panicking. So you know what's coming, and you know it's going to be dark, and it's going to be windy, and you're going to have to cover your mouths and try to cover the mouths of your children and try to keep yourself from ingesting all of that dust. There is this Associated Press reporter named Robert Geiger, and he starts driving to southeastern Colorado. He drives down to Baca County, he goes to Oklahoma, he goes into Kansas, and during his reporting from this part of the country, he coins the term the Dust Bowl. People had kind of referred it to as the dust area or the dust belt before, but in one of his dispatches, he uses the term Dust Bowl, and it sticks.
There's always been drought on the plains. There's always been dust storms on the plains, but this combination of overplowing, of mechanization, of widespread homesteading left the plains more vulnerable to drought than they had ever been in their history.
You had a perfect storm of economic crisis and climate crisis. And so those converged in the early 30s, and everything happened all at once to those poor people. And so it was really a tumultuous time.
The harvest of 1931 was a disaster. Drought destroyed much of the Great Plains wheat crop. And every year after that in the 1930s, conditions just got worse and worse and worse. Some ranchers held on. They could always eat their livestock. But for wheat farmers who exported everything, there were really no alternatives except to pray for rain or to leave.
And so you had an out-migration.
Those folks who left, they just left their buildings completely. And many times it looks like they loaded their vehicle and left everything else there. There are remnants of beds and parts of cars and domestic items.
But some people were essentially moved because the government moved them for this government program called the Resettlement Administration. It was this early attempt by the government to solve the problem of the Dust Bowl. You take families, move them to less drought-stricken parts of Colorado or elsewhere in the West, give them new farms, give them livestock, and give them a new start.
Some people were just too broke to leave. They didn't have the resources that it took to get up and leave. There were others that were perhaps a little better managers. Some of the people invested their money other places. They brought more money with them to start with and diversified their operations. Maybe they were a merchant in town or they had a job at the post office. Some people are just more tenacious than others. You know, they're just doggone hard-headed. I'm just going to stick this out no matter what. Some people didn't have anything to leave to.
So in 1930, there's over 10,000 people living in Baca County, which is the most that have ever lived in that county. In the 1930s, about 40% of the population decides to leave.
Several families lived in the area. Some of them went to California, some of them to Oregon, and the others stayed and waited it out.
By 1932, 1 in 4 Americans were unemployed. There was no market for whatever crops you could grow. There was no way out of this debt cycle. And it got so bad that farmers really had to turn to the government to help them find ways to buy time until the rains returned. The New Deal under President Franklin Roosevelt created a number of programs, the Farm Security Administration, to help support commodity prices, and most importantly for the farmers in the Great Plains, the Soil Conservation Service came along to help farmers develop new, more environmentally sensitive ways to farm the land.
The rain come back in '39 and it felt great. People planted wheat and it done good. Everybody had smiles on their face and was ready to get with it.
So you fast forward to my generation, and we were using some of the same technologies that our fathers and grandfathers used. But in the mid-'80s, we started applying more science to the soil. We realized that we could rotate our crops and we could grow residue on the ground and use harvested wheat stubble to provide an environment for the next crop.
So people just kind of experiment with new farming techniques like no-till farming, where you don't really disturb the soil very much. Plant trees to create a windbreak, contour plowing instead of doing everything straight in a row. For a lot of families, they just have to keep being kind of innovative and rethink the ways that they farm.
Farmers see themselves more as stewards of the land. They grow crops today that are very resistant to drought. They work to bring in irrigation. They work to tap groundwater.
For the ranchers, a strong recognition that out in this arid area, you need a lot of acreage to keep a cow and a cow-calf pair. And so the acreage that they allot for that is much larger. And so the idea is that they're rotating their cattle so that no one area is getting overgrazed to the point where it's not going to come back.
The Soil Conservation Service bought back a lot of the abandoned farmland that farmers walked away from during the worst of the Dust Bowl, and they created grasslands. Comanche National Grassland and Pawnee National Grassland originated in abandoned farmsteads.
These areas are not cultivated. We do allow grazing and other multiple uses, but by having areas that are stable helps the landmass overall because controlling soil erosion. What we've learned is that trying to keep the native vegetation, and where we don't have it, try to reseed it so that in this current drought we're not having the devastating effects of the 1930s.
And so with the Comanche National Grassland and the revegetation through the Conservation Reserve programs and through no-till farming have really changed the landscape. While we still have issues, we have some tools to mitigate some of that. We also have air conditioning and nice modern houses we can live in that the dirt doesn't blow through, and our tractors have got GPS guidance system on them, so we're much more efficient.
It's never going to be easy being a farmer on the dry lands of the Great Plains. But by becoming more sensitive to the landscape, by becoming sensitive to its patterns and rhythms, those farmers who were able to stay behind have managed to prosper.
If you were here on the right day, you wouldn't know that you weren't in a 1930s dust storm.
A lot of days it's sunny and calm and beautiful. And other days, why, you've got the wind and the dirt.
You get a real sense of what it was like then, although on a much smaller scale. We get strong winds with sustained winds of 45, 50 miles an hour.
What is it like to be here as a survivor of the Dust Bowl era? When the dust's blowing and it's bad, I say, it's poor judgment. It's not learning from the past.
That's just part of the Plains kind of environment. But we've never had a dust bowl ever again. Part of it is we tend to have droughts now at times when the economy isn't bad, so that kind of economic collapse isn't there.
Alleviating the Dust Bowl didn't mean that we never had dust storms again. In the summer of 2013, there were a number of dust storms on the plains as a new cycle of drought began to wrap itself around the plains once again.
Some people ask, have we rebounded from the Dust Bowl, or are we still in the process of rebounding? We've made huge improvements since the Dust Bowl to have a more stable environment. But even though we've come a long way, there's still more restoration work to do.
The big lesson of the Dust Bowl was that this unbounded optimism that you could turn the great American desert into the Garden of Eden was an overreach. That farmers needed to find ways to coax prosperity out of the land without destroying the land in the process. They were reminded in the most extreme way of the fragility of the landscape, and that they needed to treat that landscape with respect or it could turn on them very quickly.
Farming practices, ranching practices, and soil conservation practices in this part of the U.S. is different than in other areas, and that they are a little bit more fragile. Native prairie grasses and other vegetation is important to hold the soil because this is an area that drought is common.
It's mostly about learning more about the environment that you live in and kind of realizing that in order to live here, you have to make certain choices. So in some ways, the Dust Bowl is all about unanticipated consequences.
A lot of us stay here because we want to prove to ourselves and our families that if you're tenacious, if you're smart, if you're lucky, that you can live in an area that's not just perfect.
We are always going to have to be vigilant to the costs and opportunities of farming on the plains so that we never repeat the catastrophe of the 1930s.